Thanks for visiting my reading room. I'm Nancy, reader and tutor, and I'm also a small business owner of West Coast Polar Ice, Italian Ice and Frozen Specialties. You can visit my Instagram page, Icy Scoops, or my Facebook page, West Coast Polar Ice. I'm a big fan of reading aloud. I love to practice myself. I don't read nearly enough, but I think it's very important. Our country needs strong, fluent readers with great critical thinking skills now more than ever. And so this is sort of my labor of love. My mission is to build a love for reading, cover to cover, one book at a time. If you enjoy my channel, please like, share, and subscribe. I thank you all for being here and for any and all donations. God bless America. Today's classic read is from Great Illustrated Classics. It's called The Count of Monte Cristo. We begin. Chapter 1, The Ship Without a Captain. A little boy first sighted the masts of the ship Pharaon. She was coming home to Marseilles, France, with a cargo of cloth and dyes. As usual, a crowd gathered to watch the docking, an exciting event in 1815, for the handling of big sailing ships was an art. But the Pharaon proceeded toward port so slowly that the onlookers felt something must be wrong on board. Monsieur Morel, the owner, was overjoyed to hear that his ship was home. Now he saw that a tall sailor stood beside the wheel, where old Captain Leclerc should have been. Morel ordered a rowboat. He wanted to know the bad news at once. As he neared the Pharaon, he saw she was under the command of Edmond Dantes. Edmond ordered a rope dropped, and his employer climbed aboard. He looked anxiously into Edmund's dark, intelligent eyes that now were full of sympathy. "Bad news, sir. Captain Leclerc is dead and buried at sea. He came down with brain fever after we left Naples, Italy. He was raving toward the end, so I gave the crew orders from then on. Your cargo and ship are safe and sound." Morel heard this news with many changes of expressions. Though his captain was dead, before him stood a fine replacement. Edmond Dantes was tall and strong and knew the sea. His handsome face was sunburned from many voyages, though he was only 19. Morel shook Edmond's hand and thanked him. "I must consult my partner, but I think he will agree with me that the new captain of the Pharaon will be you." Edmond's face lit up with happiness. "I hoped, sir, that I might have a chance. The crew and I are like brothers. Not one resents my youth, and—" Edmund stopped and his face clouded. He was watching a man who had come from below and was now walking toward them. The newcomer was a grim-faced man, about 26. This was Monsieur Danglars. Edmund corrected his last statement. "There may be one who is not like my brother. Please excuse me, sir. I must give orders to drop anchor and dock the ship." Danglars greeted his employer with a great show of respect. He glanced around to see that no one else was listening before he said, "Monsieur Morel, I must report the mishandling of the Pharaon. No sooner was our wonderful captain dead when this Dantes seized command. Then he lost us time by putting into the island of Elba for no reason. The ship needed no repairs. Perhaps he merely wished to have a stroll ashore after being so long at sea. He is very young, you know." Morel frowned. That was very wrong. But as for taking command, he had that right. As first mate Danglars, it was good experience, since he will be the new captain, if my partner agrees with me. Danglars' grim face concealed his disappointment at these words. He wanted to be made captain himself, mainly because of the increase in salary that went with it. When Morel questioned Edmond about the stop at Elba, he found the young man's answer satisfactory. Just before Captain Leclerc began raving from his fever, he had ordered the stop. Edmond was to report to Napoleon Leclerc's place and obey any orders the ex-emperor of France gave. When Morel heard Napoleon mentioned, he looked around uneasily. Napoleon had been stripped of his powers and now lived in exile on Elba. but there were many Frenchmen who worked in secret to restore him to the throne. Morel was a businessman and did not involve himself in politics, so he asked no further questions about the visit to Elba and cautioned Edmund not to mention it to anyone else. Captain Leclerc said the same thing to me, said Edmund, and if you had not asked me, I would not have told you about Elba. Now, sir, may I request a leave of absence? Danglars will see to the listing of cargo. Morel smiled. You wish time off to get married, I believe. I have heard that a lovely young woman named Mercedes waits for you impatiently. Permission granted. Edmund's delight at this praise of Mercedes' beauty and faithfulness showed in his wide smile. Yes, sir, we expect to be married at once, but first I must go to Paris to deliver something. An hour later, Edmund was running up the stairs to the tiny apartment he shared with his elderly father. Monsieur Dantes embraced his son and gave thanks for his safe return. Much as the father wanted to hear about the voyage and to enjoy his son's presence, he knew that another shared Edmund's love. Go to Mercedes now, my boy, he said. I will prepare a special dinner for us. As Edmund hurried to her house, Mercedes was having an unpleasant talk with her cousin Fernand, a soldier. She had endured the same conversation many times since Edmund had sailed. It was Fernand's proposal of marriage. Each time he proposed, she would refuse him and remind him that she loved Edmund. Then Fernand would lose his temper, draw his sword, and wave it wildly, swearing to kill Edmund. Sighing at a familiar scene, Mercedes would threaten him again and again that if he hurt Edmund even slightly, her cousinly love for Fernand would change into hatred. Now Mercedes repeated what was always her final statement: I will never marry anyone but Edmond Dantes. At this moment, Edmund entered and heard her declaration. Mercedes sprang up with a cry of happiness and rushed into Edmund's arms. They kissed and pledged their love anew. Mercedes' eyes shone when Edmund told her he was to be the next captain of the Pharaon. Forgotten in the background, Fernand watched the lovers with bitterness. He hated Edmond Dantes with all his heart, but he could do nothing about it. Chapter 2. Arrested. Finally, unable to bear the sight of the happy couple, Fernand rushed out of the house. Mercedes followed him. Dear cousin, I want you to embrace my husband-to-be, she pleaded. I know he will find a true friend in you, as I did. Fernand shrank back from this demand, as Edmund came to him with a smile and an outstretched hand. Fernand could only bring himself to touch the hand quickly and coldly. Then he hurried away, hardly watching where he was going. He was so deep in misery that he passed by an inn without noticing Danglars and another man seated at a table outside. Glasses of wine and a half-empty bottle were before them. Danglars called to Fernand and motioned the waiter to bring another glass. At the sound of his name, Fernand looked around wildly as if awakened from a bad dream. You called me? He asked. The second man at the table was the Dantes' downstairs neighbor, a man named Calderus. Now he answered Fernand. Yes, we called. When we see a young lover running madly through the streets, we know fate has dealt him a blow, so we offer him some wine. With that, Calderus filled the third glass, but spilled wine as he poured. He had already had 7 glasses. Fernand sat down with a groan, ignoring the wine. He buried his head in his hands. Why didn't the sea swallow him up? He cried. Other men leave and never return. Why must Dantes come back to claim Mercedes? Caderousse turned to Danglars and winked. See, Danglars, you have a brother in misery. You are united in your hatred of the handsome and lucky Edmond Dantes. Danglars had only drunk 1 glass of wine, so he was still thinking clearly. As he looked at Fernand's agony, his scheming mind began to form a plan for using the unhappy soldier for his own revenge. He said lightly, in stories, one lover gets rid of a rival by a well-placed knife thrust, but perhaps real men are too timid for that. Fernand was stung by this insult, and looked up angrily. "As a soldier and a man, I would not hesitate for one moment to put a knife in Dante's heart," he cried. "But alas, Mercedes has forbidden it. I would earn his death and her hatred with the same blow." "Well then," said Caderousse cheerfully, "you will just have to see them married before the Pharaon sails again under its new commander, Captain Edmond Dantes." This time it was Danglars who looked up angrily. "I will thank you, Caderousse, not to keep mentioning my loss. If certain authorities knew what I know, Dantes would not be made captain. In fact, he would be arrested for conspiring against our good King Louis the 18th, Louis the 18th. Danglars saw, sorry, there were some Roman numerals I hadn't seen in a while. Danglars saw he had the full attention of the other men, though Caderousse was beginning to succumb to too much wine. Danglars leaned across the table and whispered, "Edmond Dantes stopped the ship at Elba and went ashore to see an enemy of the king, the exiled Napoleon. When he came back on board, he carried a letter. It was no doubt addressed to Napoleon's friends in Paris. Then after we docked, he asked Monsieur Morel for a leave of absence, not only to get married, but to take something to Paris. It must be that letter." "Where is the letter now?" asked Fernand, shocked at such dangerous conduct. "It must be in one of 3 places," replied Danglars. "Dantes may be carrying it, or he has left it at his father's apartment, or it is in his cabin on board ship." Fernand now went very pale. In a voice shaking with determination, he cried, "I shall go to the king's prosecutor here in Marseilles and denounce Edmond Dantes as an enemy of the king." Danglars shook his head in disapproval. "They will make you sign your declaration. Then they will put him in prison, but only for a few years. The day that he is freed, he will come looking for you. He will attack you, and you will have to defend yourself. As a soldier, you are experienced in fighting, and you may wound him fatally. Mercedes will hate you for that, but then she would already hate you for denouncing him in the first place." Fernand's shoulders drooped. "You are right. I can do nothing to him." "There is a way to do it, I think," said Danglars. He ordered a waiter to bring pen and ink and paper, and then he wrote a letter with his hand so in his handwriting would not be recognized. He put in all the facts he had told Fernand and Caderousse. He signed the letter "A Friend," folded it in 2, and addressed it to the king's prosecutor. Fernand took the letter and read it aloud with much satisfaction. Caderousse, though, was very drunk and made an effort to follow the reading. "Oh, that's a terrible thing to say," complained Caderousse. "Dantes is my neighbor, and I know this will break his father's heart." He reached out an unsteady hand to grab the letter, but Danglars quickly snatched it from Ferdinand and crumpled it into a loose ball. Then he said with a laugh, "You are right, friend Caderousse. We were only making a joke. We never meant to send a document because Dantes is my shipmate." He tossed the crumpled letter into the bushes near the table, then added, "Now I will help you home, for too much wine will cause a man to stagger. Goodbye, Fernand." Danglars helped Caderousse to his feet and led him away from the inn. The drunken man went willingly but slowly. As they walked up the street, Danglars glanced back. Fernand had risen and was searching in the bushes for the letter. Danglars smiled to himself, well pleased with his own cleverness and judgment of other men. Near noon the next day, a procession of people in their best clothes walked to that same inn. In the lead was Edmond, his handsome face aglow with happiness. Mercedes walked at his right, linking her arm in his. She wore a long flowing white gown. Its style was simple but elegant, making her look more like a Greek goddess than a 17-year-old girl of Marseilles. On her head was a circlet of fresh flowers. Her eyes were shining. Edmond has a single flower pinned to the jacket of his sailor's dress outfit. A similar flower adorns the lapel of old Monsieur Dantes' best black coat. He had brushed the coat well and polished its steel buttons. A three-cornered hat set on his white hair at a jaunty angle. He walked in the crowd just behind Mercedes. After them walked Monsieur Morel, the ship-owner, whose presence was a great honor. With him was Fernand, who was so pale that some wondered if he were ill. Then came Caderousse, Danglars, and all the sailors on the Pharaon. They were accompanied by their wives and sweethearts. This, then, was the procession heading to the engagement luncheon of Edmond and Mercedes. The inn was closed to outsiders that day, and all the tables had been arranged to form one long one. Mercedes sat midway with Monsieur Dantès and Fernand on either side of her. Edmond sat across from them between Monsieur Morel and Danglars. The rest of the group seated themselves as they chose, with much noise and good-natured shoving. Toasts to the engaged couple were offered, first by Morel and then by Monsieur Dantès. Soon the innkeeper and his helpers began a parade of special dishes to the celebrators. These dishes included lobster and sausages cooked in 5 different ways. The platters were decorated with clusters of tomatoes, parsley, and onions. Edmond and Mercedes were too busy gazing at each other across the table to bother eating. Edmond could not stop smiling, for he considered himself the happiest man in the world. Caderousse led all the guests in eating heartily, all, that is, except Fernand. He only picked at his food while nervously watching the door that opened to the outside. After a while, Edmond stood up and took out his pocket watch. "My friends," he announced, "I have a surprise. With Monsieur Morel's help, Mercedes and I have been able to rush through the many papers required before a marriage may take place. Therefore, this is not an engagement feast you are eating, but a wedding feast." He looked at his watch. "We will be married in exactly 1/2 hour from now. The mayor awaits us." This announcement caused a sensation, and several cheers went up. There was one last toast. Then everyone assembled at the door, ready to make the walk to the town hall into a happy parade. One of Edmond's shipmates threw open the door, only to find 2 soldiers standing there. They pushed the sailor back into the room and motioned the others to move away. A magistrate entered, wearing his official black robe. "Where is Edmond Dantès?" he asked. Edmond dropped Mercedes' hand and stepped forward. "Here, sir." In a cold, official voice, the magistrate said, "I arrest you in the name of the law. Follow me." He turned and started out. Immediately, the 2 soldiers placed themselves one in front of one, in back of Edmond, and waited for him to obey. Edmond was too shocked to move. "Arrested? Me? Why, sir," he cried, "I have done nothing. There must be a mistake." The magistrate turned back for a moment. "I have been ordered to arrest Edmond Dantès, and I am arresting Edmond Dantès. The reasons will be told to you by the king's prosecutor. Now come along." Monsieur Morel, though greatly disturbed, knew that this was the way the law did things. He whispered, "Go, Edmond. This man is only doing what he has been told. When you see the prosecutor, it will all be cleared up." These words calmed Edmond, and he said almost cheerfully to the magistrate, "Sir, I am at your service. I wish that we might go quickly so that I may return the sooner. I have important business to attend to in a half hour." At this, there was laughter and cheers. Several sailors shook Edmond's hand, and the women waved their handkerchiefs, but Mercedes had turned pale. Edmond gave her a quick smile, and with head held high, he marched out between the soldiers. Chapter 3. The Assistant Prosecutor. As Edmond departed, old Monsieur Dantès collapsed in a half-faint. He had been in poor health, and the excitement of having Edmond home and about to be married had overtired him. Now the horror of seeing his beloved son marched away between soldiers proved too much. A chair was brought, and the old man was helped into it. Mercedes rubbed his hands to warm them. "Dear father, calm yourself," she said. "Edmond will return in a short while. You saw how he smiled. It is some silly mistake. Perhaps the person is responsible for it is apologizing at this moment." Monsieur Dantès looked into her eyes. He saw the same fear in them that he knew showed in his own. "No, Mercedes," he whispered. "I feel something terrible is going to happen to Edmund." Hearing the old man speak his own fears, Mercedes turned from him and buried her face in her hands. A sob escaped her. Seeing the terrified old man and young girl, Caderousse frowned. He tried to remember exactly what had happened at the table outside the inn the day before. It was hard because he had been in a drunken haze, but enough realization of what was going on had come through. He whispered to Danglars, "This some part of the trick you were going to play, you and Fernand. It is shameful." Danglars looked at him coldly. "I know nothing about this arrest. Your drinking has confused you. Be quiet." Since Monsieur Morel was an important person, he knew that he might be able to find out the reason for Edmund's arrest. So he had followed the soldiers and their prisoner. Now, as he returned to the inn, a worried expression clouded his face. He went straight to Monsieur Dantès and Mercedes. "My friends," he said solemnly, "a very serious charge has been made against Edmund. Someone has accused him of being a secret agent for Napoleon and thus a traitor to the king." Meanwhile, in the office of the assistant prosecutor, these same accusing words were being said to Edmond Dantès. The prosecutor himself was ill in bed and had sent his capable assistant, Monsieur Villefort, to deal with the matter. The two men were alone in the room. The soldiers stood on guard outside the door. Edmund stared in amazement at the assistant prosecutor. "No, sir, I am not a secret agent. I have no political opinions. I'm only a sailor, and my concerns are my ship, my father, and my intended wife." Villefort, older than Edmund by only 10 years, was impressed by the sincere way in which Edmund uttered his statement. Villefort also saw intelligence in Edmund's face, though he realized the young man's education was confined to matters of the sea and sailing. Finally, it was of interest to him that he and Edmund shared a coincidence. Both had been celebrating their wedding feasts and had been interrupted in the middle of the festivities. Villefort's mind wandered for a moment to the lovely, rich young noblewoman he was to marry. Then Villefort brought his thoughts back to his duty. "Tell me, Monsieur Dantès, why did you stop the Pharaon at Elba and pick up a letter there?" Edmund told his story so convincingly that Villefort believed him. He asked to see the letter, but Edmund hesitated. "I have sworn, sir, to give the letter only to the person to whom it is addressed," he explained. "It is a man in Paris." Edmund's loyalty increased Villefort's admiration for him. It was obvious that the young sailor was a person of honor and that his claim to innocence was completely true. Villefort smiled reassuringly. "I represent the law here, and the law commands you to hand over the letter. In doing so, you will not break your word because my soldiers could take it from you by force. Give me the letter with your conscience clear." At these words, Edmund smiled too. "I give you the letter gladly, sir. Though you are the law, you respect a man's honor." From the inside pocket of his jacket, Edmund brought out a sealed white envelope and handed it to Villefort. The assistant prosecutor turned away from Edmund toward the lamp on his desk, so he would have more light by which to read the name on the envelope. Thus Edmund did not see the look of horror which came over Villefort's face when he read the name, fearing for a moment that he might faint. Villefort steadied himself against his desk. He dared to read the name again and the familiar address to Paris. It still read, "To Monsieur Noirtier." The letter was addressed to Villefort's father. Villefort had often told himself that one day this moment would happen, the moment when all he had worked for would vanish and he would be disgraced. But lately, as he became rich and attained the position of assistant prosecutor, he thought less and less about that moment. The final step into the secure life was his engagement to Renée. He had used his mother's name, Villefort, on coming to Marseilles, so no one connected him with the notorious traitor, Noirtier, who is loyal to Napoleon. Politically, Noirtier had been quiet for years, but as Villefort now read in the letter, his father was to come out of hiding and lead a plot to restore Napoleon to the throne. As a loyal subject to the king, Villefort could not allow the letter to be delivered, but neither could he bring himself to have his own father arrested. This was not because he loved him, but because he feared that the connection between them would inevitably be revealed. Villefort made his decision quickly, then turned back to Edmund. "Who has seen this letter beside yourself?" he asked in a calm voice. Edmund answered with surprise, "I told you, sir, no one has seen it. I myself have not seen or read the letter since it was sealed, but no one has even seen the envelope since I received it." Inwardly, Villefort gave thanks. He also gave thanks for the illness of his superior, an illness which had prevented the prosecutor from coming in the office today. If he had read the letter, Villefort would have been a ruined man. But now Villefort began to hope. He smiled at Edmund again and lowered his voice. "I believe you, Dantes, but having this letter as evidence is awkward. It is the only thing that supports the accusation made against you in this note we received." He handed Edmund the note written by Danglars with his left hand. Though the note was crumpled, Fernand had smoothed it out before he sent it. The signature still read, "A friend," with no further identification. Edmund read it and shook his head in bewilderment. "I don't know who could have written this," he said. Villefort returned the accusation to a folder marked Edmond Dantes. Then he took up the letter addressed to his father and turned it over in his hands, as if trying to decide a deep problem. Suddenly he winked at Edmund and strode to the fireplace. He tossed the letter into the flames. "I believe you are innocent, Dantes. Therefore I destroy the only evidence that exists against you." As Villefort saw the name Noirtier disappear into ashes, his heart beat normally again. "Thank you, sir," said Edmund. "You are more like my true friend than the king's prosecutor." "But now," said Villefort, returning to his desk, "you must take my advice. You must swear never to mention this letter or the name to whom it was addressed. Only you and I know it once existed." "I swear to tell no one," agreed Edmund eagerly. "If anyone questions me, I will deny such a letter ever existed." "Now I must detain you a short while longer until I have written a report," said Villefort, as an afterthought. He rang for the captain of the guards, then said something to him in a low tone of voice so Edmund could not hear. To Edmund he said, "Go with him, Dantes." Edmund saluted Villefort and followed the captain of the guards with a light heart. He counted himself a lucky man to have had a case heard by the assistant prosecutor rather than the prosecutor. Villefort had said he must only stay a short while longer. Perhaps in an hour or less he would be back at Mercédès' side. This is Chapter 4, the Château d'If. The captain led Edmund across a courtyard and into an unheated building. Its windows were small and barred. As the captain passed, soldiers stood at attention. After walking down 2 flights of stairs, Edmund was motioned into a bare room with a table and a cot as its only furnishings. After the captain shut the door, Edmund heard a bolt being drawn. He was a prisoner in a cell, but Edmund was not worried by his situation, for the assistant prosecutor himself had declared him innocent. Edmund sat down on the cot to wait. As the hours passed, Edmund consulted his watch more and more anxiously. He was especially concerned that his father and Mercédès would be worried about him. He kept reminding himself of the kindness and understanding that Villefort had shown. Finally, 6 hours later, the bolt was drawn. 4 armed soldiers summoned him out. Edmund stepped eagerly into the corridor, but was not led back to Villefort's office as he expected. Instead, he was led upstairs and into the dark street where a carriage waited. Certain that there must be another mistake, Edmund hesitated to climb in, but the soldiers gave him a shove, and he climbed in quickly. 2 soldiers placed themselves on either side of him, and the carriage set off. Soon Edmund began to smell the sea, and he knew they were nearing the docks. In another moment, the carriage stopped. Edmund was hustled out and pushed toward a waiting rowboat, manned by 4 men. A soldier waiting on the dock appeared to be in charge. He listened to the instructions whispered by the 2 soldiers and nodded. "Where are you taking me?" asked Edmund, now very alarmed. He was sure he had been mistaken for another prisoner. "I am Edmond Dantes." "We know," said the man in charge of the boat. "Get in." He put a hand on Edmund's shoulder and forced him to jump down into the boat. He followed Edmund in, then gave the command to shove off. The only point of light Edmund could see on the water was the lighthouse. But the rowers did not strain their eyes to see in the dark. They pulled steadily and confidently, as if the course they rowed was a familiar one. After his long confinement in the small cell, Edmund was grateful to smell the fresh sea air. Why should he be in a rowboat in the middle of the night, going he did not know where? "Where are you taking me?" he demanded angrily. "Does Monsieur Villefort know what you are doing?" Those questions annoyed the man in charge, for he frowned. "Don't pretend," he answered. "You come from Marseilles, don't you? Everybody knows that pile of rocks." He gestured toward a dark fortress that they were approaching. It was the only structure on the small rocky island just outside the harbor. Edmund looked where he pointed, then turned back with a gasp. "Not the Chateau d'If! Why, that is a prison." At this last statement, the man laughed. "And you, my friend, are a prisoner." "But I am innocent of any crime," he protested Edmund wildly. "I've not even had a trial. Monsieur Villefort released me." The boat scraped against stone steps. One sailor jumped out and tied the boat to a ring cemented to a massive stone wall. With a nod, the man in charge indicated that Edmund was to proceed up the steps. He did so in a daze. At the top of the steps, the man in charge kicked at the heavy door. After a wait of some minutes, the door swung open to receive their party. Another door, guarded by 2 soldiers, barred their way. After a whispered consultation with the boatman, one soldier took Edmund by the elbow and led him through the second doorway. Thus, on the 28th of February, 1815, Edmond Dantes entered the Chateau d'If. Chapter 5, number 34. Edmund was hurried down steep stone steps into a cell. Dampness and evil odors surrounded him. By the light of the jailer's lantern, he saw that the cell contained a chair, a table, a pail, and a cot, with straw and a blanket thrown on top. While one jailer brought in some bread and a jug of water, another stood guard. But it was not necessary, for Edmund was so bewildered by what was happening to him that he was too weak to move and too dazed to even breathe. When the jailers left and he heard the iron door clang shut, he sank to the floor where he had been standing. The next morning, Edmund's jailer found him still hunched over on the stone floor. He had not eaten, nor drunk, nor slept. When the jailer poked him, the spell of confusion broke at last, and Edmund wept wildly. When the jailer had gone, Edmund screamed at his closed door, demanding to know what crime he had committed. After a time, he sank into a despairing heap and stared at the floor again. When his jailer returned and saw that he had not eaten, he spoke encouragingly to him. The jailer was paid according to the number of prisoners he had to care for. If Edmund should die of starvation, the jailer's salary would be reduced. "You must keep up your strength," he told Edmund. "Perhaps in a year or 2 they will let you appeal your sentence. Others have been permitted to do so." A year or 2? Edmund was shocked. "I must speak to Monsieur Villefort now. Listen, please. I will pay you to take a message to him, and another one to a young girl named Mercedes in Marseilles." The jailer laughed loudly. "I would be fired if I were caught carrying messages for prisoners," he explained. "You could not pay me enough to make me endanger my job. There is one prisoner here, a mad priest, who frequently offers me 1,000,000 francs to help him." Now Edmund stood up, showing himself to be a strong young man. He sat in a quiet but positive manner. "If you do not help me, one time when you enter this cell, I will be behind that door. I will seize you and choke the life out of you." At this, the jailer ran from the cell. He returned a few minutes later with 6 soldiers, all armed with guns. The soldiers forced Edmund from the cell and thrust him into a dungeon at the end of a dark corridor. There Edmund closed his eyes and wondered if he was going mad. The days and nights passed slowly for Edmund. His jailers hardly spoke to him, and they never used his name. He was known simply as Number 34. For that was the number of his dungeon. Starved for conversation, Edmund begged his jailer for a few words, but the man merely shook his head no, put down the day's meal, and did not even glance at Edmund. Edmund talked out loud to himself constantly. Once he had pitied galley slaves, but now he saw that they had some happiness. At least they breathed the same air, and they had one another for companionship. Edmund had nothing. A year passed this way, and Edmund stopped trying to keep track of the date. He begged his jailers to let him go for a walk, to give him books, anything to pass the time. But his pleas were refused. Then he began to think about religion and pleaded with his jailer to permit him to see the prisoner they called the mad priest. He is still a man of the church, thought Edmund, and he will guide me in my prayers for release. But this visit was never permitted. Another year passed, and Edmund grew furious with his lot in life. He stopped praying and began to curse everyone who might have acted to imprison him. But he was so uneducated and so inexperienced in worldly matters that he could not imagine who would have wanted to harm him. Being young, he did not have many memories, so his boredom with his own thoughts became more intense. As the years passed, 4, 6, 8, 10, Edmund feared he was going mad. Sometime in his 12th year, Edmund came to a decision. I wish to die, he said aloud. I swear that I shall never eat or drink again. When his dinner was brought that evening, Edmund threw it out the small barred window into the sea. He was intent on keeping his jailer from knowing what was happening, for he feared the prison authorities might order him fed by force. For a whole week he threw out his food and drink, but the lack of water quickly sickened him. As Edmund grew weaker and weaker, it was all he could do to totter to the window and empty out his dish and mug. His jailer saw his weakness and thought he must be wasting away from some terrible illness. Finally, one evening, Edmund felt sure his end was near. He was almost happy as he drifted into a kind of twilight of half sleeping and half waking. Silently, he blessed his father and Mercedes. His breathing grew more and more shallow. In another hour, the suffering and the life of Number 34 would be over. Chapter 6. Scrape, Scrape, Scrape. As Edmund lay dying on his cot, he heard a noise, a constant scraping. His dungeon was infested with rats and large bugs, but this scraping was different from any of their sounds. Edmund raised his head weakly and listened harder. The sound was like a large claw scraping on the stone on a wall near his cot. His heart gave a great lurch as he realized that some prisoner was attempting to escape. The thought of someone making his way to freedom made Edmund feel dizzy. He told himself that his weakness was making him hear things, but the sound continued. It cannot be a workman for the prison, Edmund reasoned, because it is the middle of the night. His starving body then caused him to fall into a disturbed sleep. He awoke in the morning angry with himself. Perhaps some fellow sufferer was trying to signal him and he had not heard. When the jailer brought his breakfast, Edmund gobbled it up. His desire for death had vanished. Now his one thought was to make contact with whoever was scraping. After breakfast, Edmund waited tensely by the wall for an hour. Then it came. Scrape, scrape, scrape. He leaped up and grabbed his chair. Knocking the back of the chair against the wall, he made a clunking noise. He did it 3 times. At once, the scraping stopped. Edmund knocked 3 more times. Trembling, he waited to hear something, anything. For an hour he stood there holding the chair, ready to respond. At last, the sound behind the wall came again. In a fever of joy, Edmund beat the back of the chair against the wall. Then he stopped suddenly, fearful that a janitor might hear him. To calm his rapidly beating heart, he threw himself down on his cot. There he reproached himself for wasting 12 years by never trying to escape as the man behind his wall was trying. This thought propelled Edmund off his cot and into a search for something to scrape with. His cot had iron clamps. They were screwed tightly into the wood. His eyes lit up when he saw his water mug. Without hesitation, he dropped the mug onto the stone floor. It broke, and Edmund selected the largest and sharpest fragment. Then he attacked the wall with it. The scraping on the other side was so much like a companionship that Edmund found himself crying with happiness. The plaster that held the stones of the wall together was crumbly from age and from the dampness of the dungeon. Edmund scraped vigorously and was soon rewarded by a shadow of plaster dust and small pieces of stone. He worked through the day. Before his jailer arrived with dinner, he moved his bed to conceal the loosening stone. He tricked the plaster dust out the window, then hid the scraper under the blanket and lay down on top of it. Edmund was given another mug. The jailer did not notice that one large piece of the mug fragments was missing when he swept the fragments from the dungeon. After dinner, Edmund waited an hour before daring to go back to his task. While he waited, he rested because he was still weak from starving himself. This pattern continued for the next 2 days. By then, Edmund had cleared all the plaster from the sides of one stone, but when he tried to move the huge slab, his fingers could not budge it. He needed a lever to work the stone out. Desperately, Edmund examined his dungeon. Nothing. I cannot fail now, he told himself, pacing back and forth in his anxiety. The jailers had begun bringing around dinner. The clank of their utensils came to Edmund's ears along with an idea. His nightly soup was brought in an iron pot. Its iron handle would make a perfect lever, but the jailer usually poured his soup from this pot into his plate and took the pot away from him. Suppose, Edmund whispered to himself with a large surge of hope. Just suppose I did not have a plate. Quickly, he put his plate in front of the door, then flung himself on his cot to watch and hope. Edmund's jailer entered. All his attention was centered on not spilling the soup, so he did not see the plate before his heavy foot crunched down on it. Look what you have made me do, complained the jailer. You have left your plate in my way. First your mug, now your plate. Do you think our citizens have nothing to do with their tax money but buy you dishes? He was angry with Edmund, but also with himself, for it was his foot that broke the dish. All right, take the pot for your soup plate. See if you can keep that in one piece. Edmund also fainted with joy. At most, he had hoped to have the iron pot for one night. Now, it was to be his permanently. That night, he levered the big stone out easily with pot handle and set to work scraping around the next stone. A passageway began to form with the first stone being removed and out to conceal the entrance. Edmund found that the stones beyond it could be pushed under a certain beam that arched in back of the wall. The day came when Edmund and the first scraper were working on the same stone from opposite ends. Edmund scraped with almost insane energy as they moved the last stone aside. On their knees in the passageway, the two prisoners faced each other. They stretched out trembling hands and touched. Edmund drew the other man forward while he inched backwards toward his entrance. Back in his dungeon, Edmund reached down and grabbed and helped the other man to his feet. Who are you? Edmund asked. His voice shook so that he had to repeat the question. The man answered, I am Father Faria. The jailers call me the Mad Priest. And we'll end it right there, and we'll continue in the next reading. So hope you stand by. Thank you.